What's the hardest thing about writing? Well, it's getting started. Maybe you're having a hard time coming up with a story idea, or you're stuck on where to take your story next. If you want a way into a story or a way through, I have 9 story starters to help you. This free PDF is full of story seeds and prompts to get you going. To download your 9 story starters, go to nancypanuccio.com/start. That's Nancy with an I, Panuccio with 2 C's, nancypanuccio.com/start. Now, exposition is one of the most important craft elements to master, and it's one of the trickiest. The trick is to insert information in a story so that the reader registers the information, but isn't aware of being told the information. So the exposition doesn't call attention to itself. Writer Unleashed is for you, a writer who has a story you want to bring onto the page and into the hearts and minds of readers. I'm Nancy Panuccio, writer, editor, and writing coach. And each week, we'll explore techniques, mindsets, and inspiration for writing stories readers can't put down. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Now let's begin. Let's talk about your first chapter. There's a lot riding on it because it's what binds the reader to your story. It's your only chance to draw the reader in. It's also often the first thing you'll submit to an agent after they receive your query. They may ask for the first 10 pages, the first chapter, sometimes the first 3 chapters, but your first chapter matters. That said, your first chapter is something you'll come back to and refine again and again as you write, revise, and explore your material. So where and how you start your story may change. Your first chapter may go through many iterations. It's all experimentation for now. But there are still things to keep in mind, common pitfalls to avoid so that you don't go too far off track in your first chapter. And these are things you can apply to all your chapters. Now, sometimes writers try to pack too much in to their first chapter. It's all good exploratory information for you. It's useful. It just doesn't all need to be packed into your first chapter. So in today's episode, I'm going to go over 5 common mistakes I see in the majority of first chapters I come across, especially with new writers, and I'll give you ways to make your first chapter more captivating, because that is the aim. The main thing I see across the board is that writers try to accomplish too much in their first chapter. And remember, you have your first act to parse some of that out, to orchestrate those things in subsequent chapters. Your first act is roughly the first 25% of your book. If you have, let's say, 100,000 words, that's the first 25,000 words. So you have time and space to reveal things like significant backstory or to introduce and flesh out supporting characters. So before we dive in, what is the purpose of your first chapter? The purpose of your first chapter is to captivate and compel us to want more. It's to make us care. It's not to tell us everything. You do not need to spoon feed your reader. You want to whet their appetite for what's yet to come. So let's get right to it. Mistake number 1 is too much exposition. You want to use less. Exposition informs the reader. It's not dramatic. Writers often think that's the only way to orient the reader. So they rely on it too much, especially in their first chapter. Exposition is information that the story needs in order to proceed. So it's basic information we need to absorb what comes next or to take in the rest of the story. According to Freytag's pyramid, exposition is the first thing that happens in a story, but this is an outdated model you can ignore. You don't have to explain everything. What happened the day before, the week before, how your main character got into the situation he's in, what happened last week, etc. That's exposition that will bore your reader. It is not necessary to begin a story with exposition or to think of it as something that has to be stated directly. This goes for your first chapter or any chapter or scene. You can start with a little exposition or summary to orient the reader. You can start with a little exposition to provide the context for what we're about to see play out. For example, from Peter Cameron's coming-of-age novel, Someday This Pain Will Be Useful to You, he starts with a paragraph that's exposition. The day my sister Jillian decided to pronounce her name with a hard G was, coincidentally, the same day my mother returned, early and alone, from her honeymoon. Neither of these things surprised me. Jillian, who was between her third and fourth years at Bernard, was dating a language theory professor named Rainier Maria Schultz and had consequently become a bit of a linguistic zealot, often ranting about something called pure language, of which Jillian, with a hard G, was supposedly an example. My mother, on the other hand, had rather rashly decided to marry an odd man named Barry Rogers. Gillian, and I had both suspected that this marriage, my mother's third, would not last very long, but we assumed it would survive its honeymoon, although when we heard they were planning a honeymoon in Las Vegas, our skepticism grew. My mother, who has spent her entire life avoiding places like Las Vegas and merrily disdaining anyone who visited or even contemplated visiting such places, had announced, in a disturbing, brainwashy way, that a honeymoon in Las Vegas would be fun and a nice change from her previous honeymoons, Italy with my father, and the Galapagos Islands with her second husband. Whenever my mother said anything was or would be fun, you could take it as a warning that said thing was not nor would be at all fun. And when I reminded her of this, I used the example of her telling me that the sailing camp she had forced me to attend the summer I was 12 would be fun. She admitted that sailing camp had not been fun for me, but that was no reason why a honeymoon in Las Vegas would not be fun for her. Such is the ability of adults, well, my mother at least, have to deceive themselves. Okay, now you probably didn't think of this as exposition, and that's because it's embedded in a situation that is fraught with conflict. His sister insists on changing the pronunciation of her first name. She's in college dating a professor. He doesn't buy his mom's idea of fun and knows that she's deceiving herself. And it's not some mundane day in his life. But notice what we already know. He's young. We don't know his age yet, only that he's younger than his sister, but he lives at home in a single-parent home, and mom is not at all that stable, at least when it comes to marriage. He's not surprised that her latest marriage didn't last, and all that is implied in the exposition. It's all information we need to move forward in this chapter. And then he brings us right into it. Jillian and I were eating lunch, or some midday meal approximate to lunch, when my mother untimely returned from her honeymoon. Now, exposition is one of the most important craft elements to master, and it's one of the trickiest. The trick is to insert information in a story so that the reader registers the information, but isn't aware of being told the information. So the exposition doesn't call attention to itself. So it can be explicit, straight up information, or it can be implicit. Explicit. Charisse lived on the south side of 63rd Drive in Rego Park, Queens. Explicit. Nothing wrong with it. It's straight narration without any reaction or thought from the character. It's not filtered through her state of mind. Here's the implicit version. She wondered how many other people on the bus would get off at her stop in Rego Park. How would they react if they knew she lived on 63rd Drive across from the Lady of the Angeles School, where a week ago the mass shooting had occurred? Implicit. We're getting state of mind, thoughts. It's the same information, but it's embedded in something that's already dramatic. Same thing with the exposition in Peter Cameron's novel. It starts with exposition, but it's not direct. It's embedded in his thoughts, his take on his sister and mother. The action is ongoing, and the story's underway. Now, you don't have to start with exposition. You can just plunge us into something that's already in motion. One day starts in the middle of a conversation between the two protagonists, Emma and Dexter, in Emma's bedroom. Revolutionary Road starts at the end of the final dress rehearsal of an amateur play. The Mars Room starts on a bus leaving a penitentiary. So less exposition, use it intentionally. Okay, on to mistake number 2. Too many characters are introduced. You want to introduce less characters, please. Often too many characters are introduced in the first chapter, and it spins out of control. The reader can only metabolize so much, so you don't want to overwhelm them with too many characters and character names to keep track of. Often, the wrong characters are introduced, or they're introduced too early. Sometimes characters are introduced who won't ever show up in the rest of the novel, or will have a very minor role. So a question you can ask yourself is, why did I include this character in my first chapter? What was I trying to convey about my main character? Was I trying to convey something about where they live, or something about the setting? Was I trying to convey something about how they respond to the world around them? Those characters made it into your first chapter for a reason. So think about what purpose that character serves in the first chapter. Do you even need the character? And then find another way to get that into your story without relying on a character who we'll never see again. Now, there may be incidental characters in your first chapter that we'll never see again, and they should be there. They're functional. For example, in Revolutionary Road, the first chapter revolves around an amateur play in which one of the main characters, April, has a starring role. And so there's the director and a few actors that are part of that. The play is a flop, and these minor characters play a part in that failure. But the main focus is on April and her husband, who's witnessing his wife's failure and biting his fist, knowing that there's going to be a fallout later. We also meet 3 characters who will be supporting characters as the novel progresses. 2 of them are in the audience, and the other is a stagehand manning the lights. But they are not given a lot of airtime in the first chapter. Each of those supporting characters will be given their own chapter later on, but for now, we just need to be briefly introduced. Some characters don't need to be introduced until later. Yes, you want to get your key characters introduced in Act 1, but that doesn't mean you need to get them all in Chapter 1. When you include any character in your first chapter, the reader is going to assign some significance to them if you give them too much attention. So make sure whoever you introduce in your first chapter, those lives will intersect as the story moves forward. But you want to limit who we meet in that first chapter. Keep it simple. Of course, you'll introduce your main character, your protagonist, and whoever has some sway in how his or her life turns out over the course of the novel. In rare cases, your protagonist might not show up in the first chapter. I'm thinking of Jurassic Park, the novel. We don't meet the main character, Alan Grant, until page 33. It's chapter 6. And this goes for any scene or chapter where your protagonist is off stage. Whatever we learn when the protagonist is not present in a scene should affect the protagonist later. There are first chapters that introduce both the main character and a few supporting characters, but they make one or two characters the star and spend most narrative space on them. Supporting characters are part of the action. Revolutionary Road introduces all of the supporting characters in Chapter 1, but they all play a part in the story, and we don't learn too much about them in the first chapter. If you have one protagonist, that's who the first chapter focuses on. If you have two protagonists, say a husband and wife, or a mother and daughter, put them together in the first chapter and have them engage in something interesting, something that shows some kind of conflict, meaning one character wants something and the other wants something else. Conflict doesn't need to be contentious. It can be playful, but the idea is to show how these people are different. So with your first chapter, introduce your main characters first. 2 or 3 characters. Keep it simple. Okay, mistake number 3. There's too much backstory. Use less. Backstory is anything that happened before page 1, and it's mostly a matter of placement. Some backstory is better off delayed until later in a separate chapter, or to follow something that's happening in the present, but you don't want to linger there. Here's another example from later in the first chapter from Someday This Pain Will Be Useful to You. So Mom has already arrived home early and alone from her honeymoon. Some other things happen, and then James takes the dog out for a walk. Right outside of our building is a tree well filled with impatiens and English ivy with 2 plaques attached to the little iron trellis around its base. One reads, "In memory of Howard Morris Shulevitz, block president, 1980 to 1993. He loved this block." And then he moves into a little backstory. When I first saw this plaque about 6 years ago, when my parents divorced, my mother sold the apartment we lived in on West 79th Street, and we moved downtown. My father moved into an awful Trump building on the Upper East Side. Okay, so it's backstory. It's not a lot. And then he moves back into the present. He has one of those hideous apartments with huge curved windows you can't open and fake gold faucets and weird men in costumes in the elevator in case you don't know how to press a button. So he doesn't linger in backstory. He gives us a little piece of it, not the whole story of his parents' divorce, how old he was, how he found out, etc. We don't need to know the whole story. The story's not about that. It's just giving us insight into him and the way he views his parents. The backstory is grounded in his point of view. It's launched from something specific in the present, the plaque, and the backstory is given in specifics. And past and present are in dialogue with one another. So don't spend large chunks of narrative space on backstory. If it's crucial in order for us to understand your protagonist's internal conflict, treat it in a separate chapter. Revolutionary Road devotes a chapter to Frank Wheeler's childhood with his father to give us insight into why he makes the choices he makes and why he's conflicted. So think of backstory as significant history, why your protagonist wants what he or she wants, and what internal conflicts are impeding him or her. Significant history. This is something I learned from Doug Glover. It's background material that tells the story of how the main character arrives at the beginning of your novel, chapter 1, wanting what he or she wants. It's significant because of its relationship to your character's concrete desire and the current situation. The important thing to remember is that backstory can be brief, but it can be repeated through expansions or references or variations in subsequent chapters. Any backstory that doesn't relate to your character's desire is superfluous, and it makes your chapter flabby and boring. The reader will lose concentration, and that's exactly what you want to avoid, especially in your first chapter. Okay, mistake number 4. The first chapter isn't focused on a single event. Often a first chapter sprawls to different locations, and the character moves from their house to the car, to the office, to the park, etc. So what's an event? What do I mean by that? An event is a significant happening or situation or occurrence that advances the plot, it develops your characters, or impacts the story in some meaningful way. Someday This Pain Will Be Useful to You focuses on his mother's untimely arrival from her honeymoon. Revolutionary Road's first chapter focuses on the play. One Day's first chapter focuses on the interaction between Emma and Dexter in Emma's bedroom. One Place. The first chapter of Little Children takes place in the playground. So, an event drives the story forward by introducing a challenge or a conflict or developments that push the story in different directions. They also reveal character. So, events are opportunities for characters to react, grow, or change in response to their circumstances. They can reveal character traits, motivations, or internal conflicts. Now, an event could be one scene, or in many cases, a sequence of scenes. In Someday This Pain Will Be Useful to You, the first chapter focuses on a particular event, Mom's untimely arrival from her honeymoon. It's what unfolds over the course of that one afternoon and evening, but it's shaped around Mom's unexpected return home. So an event has its own arc. There's desire, obstacle, outcome. There's a clash between expectation and outcome. You need to know what your characters come into the novel already wanting or expecting. For example, in Revolutionary Road, the main protagonist, Frank, is hoping that his wife, April's performance is going to be a success. She's in the starring role. And when things go wrong and it's clear this is an amateur failure, she's humiliated. We're not told that, but we see it. We experience the failure and we see her humiliation from her husband's perspective. When he meets her backstage, he's thinking, what is he going to say to placate her? He says the wrong thing, and we know from her response that things are going to get worse from here. In Someday This Pain Will Be Useful to You, the main character expects his mom to stay on her honeymoon, even though he never expected the marriage to last. But he did think they'd at least survive the honeymoon. So you have the external event, but you also need the internal story. How does it affect your protagonist? We don't want anything mundane. We don't need to see your character wake up, make breakfast, get dressed, get in the car, etc. Where are we? Who's there? Limit it to a few characters and show us what happens. So rather than have your characters move from location to location, try keeping them to one location or time frame, one afternoon, a few hours, and make sure there's expectation and outcome, and that your chapter, and really all your chapters, have a clear beginning, middle, and end. If you think of your novel as a dramatic action, intention, conflict, climax, each chapter will have its own dramatic structure: intention, conflict, climax. It's a smaller version of the larger dramatic structure. The first chapter of Revolutionary Road starts out hopeful that the play will be a success and ends with failure and tense emotional distance between husband and wife. Someday This Pain Will Be Useful to You starts out with Mom coming home unexpectedly from her honeymoon and ends with James feeling hopeless about his future. Okay, last one, number 5. There's no conflict. So often a first chapter has no conflict, or the conflict is just external conflict. Conflict is simply when characters want or expect different things. So the conflict can be between the characters and or the character's own inner conflict. And it can be playful. It doesn't need to be contentious, especially in your first chapter. This is essential for any scene or chapter, but your first chapter should have conflict built into it. In Someday This Pain Will Be Useful to You, Mom comes home, and this is 4 pages in. James and Jillian are in the kitchen eating lunch. "Oh, good Lord," my mother said when she entered the kitchen and saw us. "What are you two doing here?" "What are you doing here?" asked Jillian. My mother went to the sink and scowled disapprovingly at the dirty dishes and glasses. She opened the cupboard that housed glasses, but it was empty, for Jillian and I had been favoring the technique of rinsing and reusing glasses rather than washing, storing, and reusing. "My God," my mother said, "all I want is a drink of water, a simple drink of water. This is all I want." And that, like everything else I have ever wanted, appears to be denied me. A little later in the conversation, Jillian asks again, "Why are you home? Where is Mr. Rogers?" Both my sister and I enjoyed calling our mother's new husband by his surname, even though we had been urged repeatedly to call him Barry. "I neither know nor care to know where that man is," my mother said. "I hope I never see Barry again in my life." "Well, best to discover that now," said Jillian, "although I suppose it would have been best to discover that before you married him, or before you agreed to marry him, or before you met him." "Jillian," my mother said, "please." "It's Gillian," said Jillian. "What?" my mother asked. "My name is Gillian," said Jillian. "My name has been mispronounced long enough. I have decided that from now on, I will only answer to Gillian. Rainier Maria says naming a child and then mispronouncing that name is a subtle and insidious form of child abuse." "Well, that's not my style. If I were going to abuse you, there'd be nothing subtle or insidious about it." My mother looked at me. "And you," she said, "why aren't you at the gallery?" "John didn't need me today," I said. "That is not the point," said my mother. "John never needed you. You do not go there because you are needed. You go there because I pay you to go there so you will have a summer job and learn the value of $1 and know what responsibility is all about." Okay, so you get the idea. You want to think of each character before page 1, before we meet them. What is their state of mind? What do they want? What do they expect? How are those expectations thwarted? And how do all these expectations and worldviews clash? The first chapter of One Day is another great example of 2 people who have very different views on life and want different things from one another. Conflict. For more on conflict, listen to episode 125, How to Write Conflict into Every Scene. episode 125. I'll link in the show notes on my website. Okay, so let's recap. There's a lot riding on your first chapter. Its purpose is to bind your readers to your story. It's to make them care. If they care, if they're pulled in, they will be hungry for more. Your first chapter should absorb them enough to want to keep reading. An agent, for example, will read your first chapter and say, "Give me the whole manuscript, please." So here are 5 ways to nail your first chapter. Number 1, less exposition. Be more intentional about how and when you use exposition. The best exposition doesn't feel expository because it's embedded in something that's already dramatic. Number 2, less characters. Your first chapter only needs to introduce your protagonist and essential supporting characters. I would say 2 or 3 characters at most. But you want to put most of the focus and narrative space on your protagonist. Number 3, less backstory. Think of backstory as significant history. It's tied to your character's desire and circumstance. Backstory should be brief in your first chapter, but can take more space later on. Number 4, shape your first chapter around one event. It should have a beginning, middle, and end. And number 5, make sure there's conflict. Think of what each character wants from the others, what they expect, and then overturn those expectations. Now, remember, you don't have to nail your first chapter before you go on to the rest of your story. Remember, it's something that you'll come back to again and again and refine as you write, revise, and explore your material. So there you have it. Thanks for hanging out with me today. And if you know any writers who need some support in their writing, please share this episode or the Writer Unleashed podcast in general. And if you love what you're listening to, subscribe on your favorite listening platform and please leave me a review. Reading how this podcast impacts your writing truly lights me up and helps me create topics for the show. Till next time, keep writing, and I'll talk to you soon.